Welcome to the Ruptured Histories webinar. This is the fifth iteration to the webinar Extraction, Coloniality and the Decolonization of Identities. And I'm sure you all read the flyer and the program. My name is Robert Jan Muller and I'm from AICA Netherlands. So the moderator today. This is the fifth Ruptured Histories webinar. The series started in 2021. It was initiated and organized by a group of AICA members worldwide, assembled in what is now called the AICA Forum Committee, which was, of course, before that, the Fellowship Fund Committee of AICA. We had four previous webinars. That was on decolonization of the museum. The second one was a webinar aimed at critical dialogue between former colonized and colonizers. That was done in conjunction with the Karachi Biennale. And then the third one was about decolonization of public artworks and monuments by artists in Baltic countries and South Africa. And the fourth one was called it was about the uncomfortable heritage of post-Soviet art institutions and buildings in former Soviet states. And for this webinar, we have chosen for the notion of extraction in relation to coloniality. Shortly, the extraction of individuality, communities, belief systems, gender, ecology, we think is perhaps the essence of colonialism and the more lasting structure of coloniality. Which is a more enduring and lasting systemic structure with its cultural norms and thought patterns that lasts long after the colonizer has left. Our webinar thus focuses on the extraction of identities, their frameworks, and their resources. So we have three speakers for today. We are very honored that they accepted our invitation. That is our respondent Christian Gravagna and two presentations by Paula Albuquerque and Sandra Gamara Hishiki. I will do a little introduction later on, but first I would like to tell you how we're going to do it in the organizational sense these next 2 hours. First, we will have Christian Gravagna as a respondent, but also as an introduction. He will have a presentation of about 15 minutes, followed by the presentations of Paula Albuquerque and Sandra Gamara Hashiki. You will be able to participate in the discussion after all the presentations. So first Christian, then the two presentations of Paula and Sandra. Then we have, let's say, a response of Christian Gravagna, and which will last maybe 15, 20 minutes, maybe longer, but please write your contribution or question in the chat, in the margin of your screen. And you can also respond by speaking, but that you have to signal that by putting your hand up, you know, with the button on your screen. I'd like to ask you to please keep your microphone muted. I think Camille, who's in Paris, has muted you all by now. And after the, in the end, I will see what questions there are or remarks, and I will then pick some, and then I'll give you the opportunity to elaborate on your question. Okay, we will start now with Christian Gravagna. He's an art historian and a curator. He is professor of post-colonial studies at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. His research focuses on decolonial politics of liberation in art, culture, and theoretical thinking. One of his recent books is The American Museum, Slavery, Black History, and the Struggle for Justice in Museum of the South, which was published in Vienna and Berlin in 2019. And in 2024, he curated the exhibition Avant-Garde and Liberation, Contemporary Art and Decolonial Modernism at the Museum of Modern Art Stiftung Ludwig in Vienna. Okay, Christian, I'd like you to start.
Yeah, okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting me to sharing this conversation on questions of decolonization. Of course, I have been working in the field of art history, liberation movements, and decolonization for the last 15 to 20 years. So, of course, I very much appreciate the subject of your webinar series. When I heard about the title, or I read about the title of your program, Ruptured Histories, it very much resonated with some of my own considerations on questions of history, of course, but also of time and temporalities that are experienced and lived very differently by different groups of people, different communities, both in the past and in the present. And I think it really resonates with the exhibition that Robert Jan just mentioned, which I curated last year at MUMUC in Vienna. So I thought I would present a few slides and speak about a few artworks from this context. So, I mean, the field is large, the field is broad. There are so many aspects, of course, to discuss. And one of the aspects that I have been focusing on in much of my, or large parts of my own work, but I would also like to focus on today in my own presentation, is questions of time and temporality. And in the short abstract, which I wrote for the announcement of this program, I mentioned one of the most important decolonial authors, namely Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, who published his book, Decolonizing the Mind in the 1980s. So it was a call for the decolonization of the consciousness, the mind, the cultural and the academic sphere or field in a post-colony 20 years, 25 years after independence. And as soon as a writer like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, but many others also from the last few decades, post-independence, as soon as they call for a program or the work that has to be done in regard to decolonization, they also feel the necessity to look back. And what Ngugi wa Thiong'o does, he wants and he feels the need to build on what he calls a tradition of resistance. So the current, the topical always has to also return to something that comes or came before to build on. So I think the work of decolonizing consciousness, subjectivity, or identity is directed toward the future, but it cannot do without a historical perspective. And this was one of the questions that I also addressed in this exhibition. Maybe I can share now my presentation. And so this just to give you an idea, maybe if you want to, are interested in the names of the artists. So I also included the back cover of the catalog. It was an exhibition that I developed in conversation, in contact, in discussion with 24 artists from South Asia, Africa, Europe, and some parts of the Americas. And it deals with the question of how contemporary artists, meaning the last 10, 15 years, how they feel the need within their own critical work on topical issues of racism, of fundamentalism, of nationalism, neocolonialism, to go back to something, someone from the past, movements, forerunners, ancestors, in terms of artworks and liberation movements. So I created this exhibition together with these invited artists from different places of the world. And we engaged in a kind of conversation on these questions of time and temporality in regard to the critical negotiation with the now, related or based on a critical examination of the past. Maybe it's a bit weird, but I would like to start with an artwork that was not part of my exhibition. This is the only artwork that I failed to organize for my exhibition. I was really happy to get almost all the works that I wanted to have. But Marlene Smith, a British artist's work, I wanted to start with is that's a much older work from the 1980s. And that, apart from many other reasons, one reason I find this fascinating is also the title. I'm an art historian, and I have always been learning. I've always been an art historian, learning a lot from artists, also not just about the world and about art, but also about methods and approaches to art history and art history writing. And this work from the 1980s speaks to me as an artist's proposal to think critically about art history. So this is 1987. It's the British Black Arts Movement. Marlene Smith, one of the major members of this movement. And she calls the installation or the arrangement art history, presenting for small pictures in reproduction by artists, even from the 19th, black artists, even from the 19th century. So it's really about kind of genealogy of how and why and how and by which means and through what kind of protagonists and activists did we come where we are at the moment. So she goes even back to the 19th century artist Edmonia Lewis, who was an African-American, Native American artist working in Europe mainly at the time. Now I'll give you, this is again a page from the catalog, because I think it really goes well with what you said about ruptured histories and these kind of problematics, complex, complicated concepts of time and temporality that we need to discuss when it comes to questions of decolonization. In this conversation with African-American or kind of, let's say, African diasporian art historian and curator Nana Adosei-Poku, we spoke about these questions, and the title of the conversation I took from a sentence that she spoke in this conversation. And I think this futurity, a kind of future that we are working on when we try to decolonize society, museums, art history, whatever, this futurity is embedded in a past that allowed for an otherwise to emerge. So it's a quote from her. And I think it brings to the point what it is about to think about the future and the present in regard to what happened in the past. I should also note maybe that when it came to discussions, I mean, it's always interesting to to reconsider what you have had in mind when you conceived an exhibition, and what do you have in mind after the exhibition experience. So for instance, what I actually learned through the conversations with so many Black and artists of color working in different parts of the world, that my own idea, my own concepts of history, of the now related to the past, and so on, it's quite problematic for many of these artists who speak about the impossibility of make a difference between the present and the past. So there is no past. There is no past tense, as James Baldwin said in one of his writings, when it comes to the Black experience, or what, for instance, an art, cultural studies writer like Christina Sharp said when she titled her book "In the Wake." So there is a life in the wake of what happened through slavery and colonialism. So now a very brief look into one kind of constellation of artworks in this exhibition last year. It's the entrance situation on the second floor. And what you see is 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5 artworks that you approach when you enter the room. To the left, there is 2 works by African-American artist Radcliffe Bailey. To the right, there is a series of small circular photographies by an artist based in Vienna, and in the back you see a painting by African-American artist Farhano Bekou. But I will address that later. First, I would like to start with this kind of curatorial decision of bringing together, even if I, as I just mentioned, consider it quite problematic to make this difference between the past and the now or the present. We tried to create a constellation that enables a conversation between artworks that refer to the, we could speak of some kind of origins of decolonization movements, even if decolonization doesn't have an origin, or not one, of course. Radcliffe Bailey's work, the sculpture to the left, is I would say, yes, here's a detail, alluding to, maybe some of you will notice, alluding to revolutionary figures of the Haitian revolution around 1800. So the first successful decolonization movement in a French colony in the 18th, very early 19th century. And at the same time, with the glitter on the surface or on the skin of this head, he is also making reference to practices of healing, spiritual practices in Haitian voodoo culture. So there's this 1800 reference where it all comes from somehow when we think of the early revolutionary decolonial movements. And there is also, we could speak of a political reference, of a cultural reference, and here we also, in the second piece by Radcliffe Bailey, we have another moment of the healing practices, the questions of home, the questions of caring, the questions of feeling protected, that have to do with the power and spirit of decolonization. When he, in his painting, mixed media work painting called Mahalia, obviously referring to Mahalia Jackson as one of the important gospel singers of the time, and on the other hand, formally referring to a tradition of quilt making, African-American quilt making, that is also important when it comes to creating or providing a feeling of home and protectedness. So the musical aspect and the textile aspect of how the music and the clothes kept the children, in this case, particularly Radcliffe himself, warm when he lived with his grandparents. So this is kind of this is a form of historically, culturally looking back, and on the other hand, we have the same room, opposite wall, a series of 10 circular photographies, kind of portrait photographies of 10 artists and cultural producers in the Vienna art scene, all artists of color by Janine Gimberi, asking these sitters of her portrait photography to make contact. So it's called channeling, meaning making contact, like in a spiritual session, with the ancestors, meaning the ancestors of a culture, a political, a social movement of liberation from racist oppression, from colonial practices, and from institutions, exclusionary political and cultural institutions. So we see that people with closed eyes, they see more than we see, obviously, because we can't really follow their spiritual connection with, but we can imagine if we read the titles of the works, like Janine channeling Sarah Maldoror, or Esther channeling Faith Ringgold. So these protagonists of the series, they channel an African-American painter like Faith Ringgold, very important figure, of course, but also a decolonial filmmaker like Sarah Maldoror. Yeah, this is just the opposite view into the same room. It also includes a very beautiful work by Zoe Leonard, which is a stack of first edition copies of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, also reflecting on the question of what does it mean. Also, it's produced in the 1960s. The fire next time, what does it mean the next time? Is it now? Is it now that everything it's called tipping point, so it can fall easily if the system isn't being changed in time. And maybe a last work from this constellation of pieces in this entrance situation by Peruvian artist William Cordova. This is also, I think, one of the good examples of what you might have had in mind when you spoke about ruptured histories, and what I have in mind or had in mind when I conceived this exhibition about questions of temporality in regard to liberation movements and decolonization. In this work, which uses a kind of display structure that refers to third cinema makeshift display structures from the 1960s and 70s, and brings together two pieces, two films, actually. One film is about Tupac Amaru, the Inca independence, liberation, revolutionary activist of the 18th century, Tupac Amaru II, a film from the 1980s. And there's a film about Tupac Shakur, the, of course, well-known rap artist of the late 20th century, who was actually named after Tupac Amaru. One film is to be seen without sound, and the other film is to be listened without images. So we have two films of the same, exactly the same length, presented in a structure that allows us as the viewer not to get access to the whole, but we have to combine, and actually we find some ways to combine the the history of the 18th century liberation movements with the history of the late 20th century cultural liberation movements of Black people. And I think that I can close with this, actually. I mean, maybe I have one more slide, but would like to refer to a notion of the artist himself, William Cordova, when he speaks about his work. He often uses the term of discontinued movements, which resonates with Ruptured Histories, of course, meaning movements like political movements of decolonization, of emancipation, anti-racist movement, civil rights movement, whatever, have been discontinued all the time. And other movements, contemporary movements, and sometimes it's artists, cultural producers, find the ways to continue or to continue a discontinued movement of the past with their own and different means. And so I think this is it's one of the proposals on how we can deal with these complex questions. So this is the last view on Farham Bekou's work. That is also, I mean, of course, always difficult to speak about artworks in a few seconds, but this is one of the artworks that makes it quite clear, I think, almost at first glance, that there's an artist, a Black male artist in the United States, living under conditions of racist oppression, persecution, violence, physical violence, the threat of being shot and whatever. He imagines himself, or he puts himself into relation to two, I would say, two different paths, if we even can them call past properly. Meaning, one is the African tradition of spirituality and art, in particular the Yoruba tradition, and the other one, of course, this is marked by the masks that he uses, and the other historical reference is on negritude and Harlem Renaissance movements of the 1920s, 1930s. So you have a modernist. You have a reference to the decolonial modernism of the 1920s and 30s, and you have a reference to the African spiritual and cultural traditions when it comes to the necessity to understand one's own critical, problematic, endangered role as a Black man in a racist society. So this is kind of a layered a layered structure of historical reference that seems to be necessary to understand the decolonization of a certain contemporary identity.
Yeah.
I think I leave it like this, right? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful, Christian. Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation, and how you connect, as you say, time and temporality with as a context for consciousness and identity. You were talking about, you used the notion futurity. Is that right?
Yeah, I did not really, I quoted it. It was Nana Adusepoko who used it, yes. She was creating this exhibition on Black Melancholia. Melancholia as a kind of spiritual or psychic or mental state that always has a relation to the past, of course. And Black Melancholia in particular related to the ever unfinished movements of equal justice and so on. And in this case, it's a futurity, like a maybe it's a phrase that comes close to the structure of a temporality in difference to in distinction to time.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's move on to Paula Albuquerque. And she is an Amsterdam-based Portuguese artist and a scholar. She is currently a senior researcher at the Rietveld Art Academy in Amsterdam, an assistant researcher at the Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and a supervisory board member of the Amsterdam-based Frame Contemporary Art platform. She has been commissioned by the iFilm Museum, which is in Amsterdam, to make work with materials from the colonial collection for a group exhibition in 2026. Her presentation is about her current research into colonial non-fiction films, which analyzes structures of representation and their long-term impact on subjectification. So Paula, please start.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Also, Christian, thank you very much for your presentation. I think I can already find quite some resonances that, will be very productive for our discussion later on. I too am very interested in the overlapping temporalities. I've been working with surveillance for several years now. And all the, when we're discussing where these stereotypes of race and gender are coming from that are so present in the training of, in the data sets that are training the algorithms, for me, it was of interest to really look back and try to find or at least unveil certain visual languages that come from certain film traditions. And that's what I'm going to be discussing today. It's the project that I'm working on right now. I am placing a timer for myself, and I will be reading from a paper that I prepared also to make sure that my terminology is rigorous enough and also that I keep it compact. So I will start by sharing my screen. Please, oh no, wait, sorry. I have to share it with sound, otherwise we cannot hear the film. Yes, it's all there. And please let me know if something is not working at a particular moment. So this project examines colonial documentary cinema from a historical, decolonial, and archivist perspective, extending previous investigations on Dutch colonial films conserved at iFilm Museum Archive in Amsterdam, and now including films from the Portuguese Cinematheque, namely the National Archive of the Moving Image. The critical analysis addresses the contents, production, and distribution of the films, focusing on the politics of representation. The comparison between Dutch and Portuguese cinematographic approaches reveals Eurocentric visions that reinforce racial stereotypes, hauntingly reflected in contemporary surveillance practices. Methodologically, it integrates media theory, film philosophy, and decolonial theory, while using artistic research to explore political dynamics through experimental cinema and installations. So as a Portuguese artist and researcher with Indian ancestry, I study colonial non-fiction films as a form of proto-surveillance. My analysis focuses on those cinematographic techniques that contribute to the subjectification of indigenous people through the use of visual languages that construct images of the other, establishing subaltern identities in former European colonies. This presentation addresses my anarchivist research, highlighting emancipatory strategies that challenge dispossessive subjectification, both in academic and artistic contexts. To this end, I base myself on the tradition solidly built by theorists such as Sandeep Ray, Maria do Carmo Pissarra, Ella Choate and Robert Stam, Irene de Craan, Nadine Monem, and Edouard Glissant. Referring to the imperial imaginary, Ella Choate and Robert Stam assert that colonial domination, resource exploitation, and global control through classification and surveillance reached their peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time that witnessed the rise of cinema. By directly applying the notion of Eurocentric imperial imaginary in the analysis of the Dutch colonial film collection, I propose the analytical angle of Sandeep Ray's book Celluloid Colony from 2021, which analyzes films shot in Indonesia in the 1920s and 1930s. According to Ray, these films served as state-sponsored propaganda to justify and legitimize Dutch rule over the East Indies. They represented the government's version of living conditions and past events in the former colonies, often portraying colonial rule as benevolent and well-received. Ray highlights how, under the guise of objective representation, Dutch colonial rule attempted to create audiovisual narratives of, and I quote, of pre-independence Indonesia that were apparently peaceful and demonstrating adequate administration, end of quote. The author demonstrates the careful construction of the propaganda machine and its effectiveness in keeping the Dutch public convinced of the veracity of the reality they were watching. In fact, the exploitation of workers, their murder, and the burning of local homes were left out of the non-fiction films that idealized Dutch colonialism. Similar to the Portuguese portrayal of a unified national identity that fostered fraternity between the continent of Portugal, obviously, where Portugal is located in Europe, and the colonized territories until the 1970s. And I quote, viewers were served with an endless visual stream of Dutch colonial benevolence and alleged expertise, making it difficult to imagine that Dutchmen could be responsible for horrendous acts, end of quote. These non-fictions were part of a form of surveillance that contributed to the identification of complacent and docile individuals, as opposed to other indigenous people who did not accept the supposed help of the Dutch occupiers and therefore opposed the supposedly benign influence offered by the apparently kind-hearted settler. Nonconformists were classified as suspicious and potentially dangerous dissidents, justifying their persecution and oppression. Indigenous women in these films were portrayed as subaltern and hypersexualized, reduced to servants and concubines. I want to show you a bit of, or a fragment of a film that I made using some of these materials.
Adapun siluman mengacu pada sesuatu atau seseorang yang tidak nampak, juga dipakai untuk mengacu pada hantu atau setan. Hantu hadir melalui keangkaran yang ditimbulkannya. Dia mengantar kita ke dalam kebulatan rasa yang dialami sebagai pengakuan atau rekognisi. Keangkaran yang ditimbulkan aneka hantu atau setan selalu mengacaukan keseimbangan batin dan menimbulkan kengerian, syok, dan ketakutan. kekacauan emosi itu lalu memungkinkan pihak yang terpaku keangkeran untuk menyadari kehadiran seseorang atau sesuatu, meski tidak hadir secara nyata, hanya sebagai bayangan.
My film Siluman critiques the art historical notion of the sublime as implanting a Western aesthetic defined by the desire for conquest and exploration of the unknown, supporting the appropriation of vast territories and the stripping of indigenous peoples of their humanity. And I'll just put back the poster, it makes more sense. In the words of Nadine Monem, the colonial gaze makes local people invisible as human beings and simultaneously hypervisible as objects. Such othering notions continue to have an impact on the contemporary reality of Buru Siluman, the Indonesian term that translates as ghost workers, which is the title still given to women who work in contemporary Indonesian palm oil plantations and who, following the tradition imposed by Dutch settlers during the colonial period, remain poorly paid or in some cases even unpaid and are considered invisible like specters. Since January of this year, I have been visiting the National Archive of Moving Images of the Portuguese Cinematheque, as mentioned earlier, to research the colonial film collection. I started with the Asia section, the smallest and most manageable, focusing on India, partly because of my family's long presence in Goa, where my father was born. Unlike Dutch colonial cinema, which was very active in the East from the 1920s onwards, especially in Indonesia, Portuguese cinema arrived later in the former Asian colonies. As Maria do Carmo Pissarro observes, the Estado Novo, which is the fascist regime that was ruling between 1933 and 1974, instrumentalized cinema mainly for propaganda purposes, concentrating on the African colonies while neglecting the Asian ones such as India and East Timor. Although cinema was regarded as a powerful tool for mass influence, it remained almost absent in the so-called Portuguese East. My current focus is actually on domestic films produced by Portuguese settlers in this region during the 1950s. Although I did not begin to make artworks with them, in particular, I am awaiting the digitization of a very specific film so that I can start a new piece. These amateur films, created by the Portuguese middle class, offer a rare visual archive of colonial life, providing valuable information about everyday routines and the ideologies underlying the last phase of Portuguese colonialism. The films emphasize particular visual motifs: families of white settlers at leisure, indoor domestic spaces arranged in a distinctly European way, and social rites such as functions, snacks, or children's birthday parties. These images build a sense of normality and comfort, a microcosm of the European lifestyle transposed into an exoticized and colonial setting. In stark contrast, these home movies also frequently include images of expansive landscapes, most often sparsely populated or filmed from a distance, evoking an impression of territorial vastness and a latent potential for development or exploitation of resources and capital. This duality, contrasting cultivated and civilized interiors with representations of open, uncontained, and untamed exteriors, reflects a vision of the colonial world structured around binaries of order and disorder, familiarity and otherness, comparable to the content of Dutch colonial film production 2 decades earlier. Recurring motifs in these films include portraits of local cultural events, including traditional dances, processions, and musical performances. Although ostensibly documenting indigenous customs, these sequences are framed through an exoticizing lens, functioning less as a genuine ethnographic investigation and more as a visual spectacle for the colonizing gaze. Similarly, images of well-known tourist landmarks like churches, forts, beaches, and markets appear repeatedly, suggesting a colonial tourism that reaffirms the aesthetic and cultural dominance of the Portuguese heritage in the region. The aesthetics that emerge from these films can be described as pseudo-ethnographic, serving to reinforce colonial hierarchies by presenting a sanitized and domesticated version of settler life juxtaposed against a romanticized and often depersonalized backdrop of native culture and landscape. Ultimately, these domestic films act as objects of personal memory and Eurocentric ideological artifacts. They reveal not only how the Portuguese settlers in mid-20th century India saw themselves, but simultaneously how they wished to be seen as agents of civilization in the midst of a supposedly chaotic and backward environment. As such, they offer a crucial insight into the cultural mechanisms of late colonialism, illuminating the everyday performativity of imperial identity during its final decades, which actually you can really hear in the last speeches of Marcelo Caetano, who was the last fascist leader in Portugal before 1974 revolution. Between the surface are hidden tensions that are rarely revealed, and in cases where they do become visible, only to display demonstrations of support for the Portuguese settlers by the people of Goa, in the form of flags and banners, with messages explicitly against the advance of the Indian Union between 1947 and 1961. Such portraits reflect a political strategy to underline what, according to Pissarra, built an imagined community of Indian and Portuguese individuals living together in harmony with no signs of resistance on the part of the locals against the settlers. According to Showhat and Stam, cinema's ability to fly viewers from all over the world has positioned them as audiovisual authorities. This, and I quote, spatially mobilized visuality of the imperial eye/I expanded globally, generating a dynamic experience of imperial travel and conquest, transforming the European public into armchair conquistadors who, reinforcing their power, transformed the colonies into a spectacle to satisfy the voyeuristic gaze of the metropolis. To counter the wide-ranging effects of imagetic subjectification on colonial and post-colonial mentalities, archival materials must be not only revisited, but directly intervened upon. Such a strategy involves protecting the privacy of the people filmed and revealing, when possible, the potential of their agency observable in the frame. Revisiting colonial cinema involves, therefore, more than the analysis of images and modes of production, revealing how, despite good intentions, colonial visual legacies persist in these films. An archivist artistic intervention becomes a method not only for creating new works, but for discovering forms of agency obscured by Eurocentric visual strategies. Of the various artistic approaches I employ, I'd like to highlight today, during this presentation, the programming of a glitch to protect the naked bodies of indigenous people, as in my film Like the Glitch of a Ghost, which I'm about to show you a fragment of, and the combination of disembodied voices as narrators of untold stories, as in Siluman, of which I've already showed you a fragment.
Vanuit Paramaribo leidt de arts van Maaseik dit werk door radiocontact en periodieke bezoeken per vliegtuig, het enige middel om er te kunnen komen.
Wat mij ontzettend opviel toen ik hier in het begin kwam, dat ze zo vriendelijk zijn. Ze zijn vrolijk de hele dag. Je hoort nooit iemand mopperen. Je merkt het niet aan ze dat ze, zoals wij dus zeggen, chagrijnig zijn. Beslist niet. Maar ik koeken kan. En wel eens je dat? Adime.
Mama, mama, un moos, hin, moos, huis,
Huis.
un huis, moos, de poes,
Poes.
poes,
Poes.
Wat doe je nu in gevallen die je hier niet behandelen kunt?
Als er dus inderdaad iets is, dan roep ik dus dokter Van Mazijk op in de stad.
Hoe doe je dat dan?
Per radio. We hebben dus een klein radiozendtoestelletje hier. Dan komt hij aan de radio en kan ik het geval met hem bespreken als ik dus niet weet wat ik dus moet doen in dat geval.
I take this opportunity now to show you the project I am currently working on for a group exhibition that explores the colonial collection of the Eiffel Museum that opens in February 2026, curated by Hisham Khalidi, and in which the installation explores the possibility of emancipation of the subject within the frame. The images you are about to see are the result of extensive experimentation with films made by Paul Julien, a Dutch high school teacher and self-proclaimed ethnographer, during holiday trips to Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast. None of these countries were ever or was ever a Dutch colony, as you might know. However, Julien practiced phrenology methods on the basis of eugenic strategies, such as measuring body parts, including people's heads, so their skulls, and taking fingerprints and even blood samples from local people. The end result of this research of mine will be a video installation that incorporates the glitch, once again, to merge with the bodies of indigenous people involuntarily filmed and subjected to these subalternizing processes. Paraphrasing the Dutch curator Irene de Kraan, who in turn quotes the decolonial thinker Rolando Vázquez, the sovereign gaze considers the colonial order as a spectacle. The act of seeing stages and positions colonial difference as aesthetic. If the modernist gaze can be considered as an epistemology, how can we approach the act of looking, questioning the modernist emphasis on access and unveiling, and unlearning the ingrained paradigm that aligns vision with freedom and progress? Modernity's insistence on maximizing visibility has contributed to the creation of the other through cinema and has evolved into today's surveillance of mass visibility. Apparently, according to Kraan, the right to be invisible is undermined by the need for visibility and control by governments for the possible apprehension of lawless citizens, and the argument used is the collective right to freedom and security. Obviously, it is not a question of denying the representation of marginalized communities, but that this must occur in its total complexity. In Edouard Glissant, the right to opacity is the right of oppressed individuals not to be reduced so as to be accepted or controlled. Preventing full visibility is intended to be a practice embedded in the concreteness of anarchivist research to ensure that various, and I quote, opacities can coexist and converge, composing fabrics. To truly understand them, you need to focus on the texture of the weave rather than the nature of its components. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing now. So I hope that everybody could hear and see the images.
Thank you, Paula. That was great and revealing. I think I'll never forget the notion of armchair conquistadores. It's I think the everyday the everyday stereotypes you are presented with in these films, in the sense that you don't realize what the relationships are actually in these films as you present it in this last glitch film, as it were, that the colonizer is the visible person, and it's a female voice. I think it's a nun, or she's a religious nurse, in a film that, by the way, because that wasn't subtitled, the title of the film is "The Suriname People Belong Here Too." Well, of course, it's filmed in Suriname, and so it's totally from the viewpoint of the colonizer, of the Dutch, in this film, and of course it's the nurse who is visible, but the people she is treating, and well, she is caring for, they are a blur. At what moment did that occur to you? I mean, the normality of colonialism in these films, what you called the civilizing aspect of colonialism, the perceived civilizing aspect of colonialism. But when did occur this to you when you did your research?
Well, yes, thank you for that question. It's I was really confronted with it because as I was looking for all these stereotypes, I realized that in these films that were supposedly full of very good intentions, like, we, the Dutch, need to go to Suriname and teach these people who have been, these are the Suriname's Indians, so they had been there for 500 years, and we are the ones that have to come there and actually help them survive. And so by watching this film, I felt very much like, yes, we need to bring films like this to the center of our debates on ongoing colonialism. But I cannot repeat this colonizing gaze. I would say it's not the same in every film, but in this particular film, it was it was almost pornographic. It was really, I could not do this. So how do I do it without erasing the people? You called it a blur. I did not want to mask them out. But I did not want to show that they were naked or very poorly dressed, which is also a strategy by many of these directors. And okay, I'll try to be brief now. Basically, what I did was I fused their bodies with surveillance imagery from nature. So from trees and from animals, that is being filmed right now in Suriname. And by doing that, I allow the bodies to get a third dimension, just not, again, this othering that is based on epidermalization and, people being shown as being poor and being sick, etc. So that I will stop now.
We can elaborate on it after the talk of Sandra Gamara-Heshiki. She's the next speaker. Welcome. Sandra Gamara-Heshiki was born and raised in Peru, Lima, where she studied fine arts at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru. In 2003, she moved to Madrid to complete her art studies, where she has developed her work until 2019. As she herself wrote, her Peruvian background adds a syncretic gaze, where pre-Columbian, colonial and Western cultures collide. Some of her recent exhibitions recontextualize art genres such as landscape, self-portrait, or still life. Last year, she presented an installation, Pinacoteca Migrante, in the Spanish pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 2024. Please, Sandra, go ahead.
Hi, very nice to be with you, and thank you for your invitation. I'm very sorry, I'm not very good English. My English is not so good, so please be patient with me. I will share my screen. It's good? Yes. Okay, as she said, I was born in Lima, where I grew up and lived until I obtained my painting degree. I come from a mixed family. My Peruvian father comes from an Andean, Afro-Peruvian, and a Spanish background, what we call mestizo, and my mother comes from the Japanese colony that immigrated to Peru at the beginning of the past century. I grew up between two sensibilities, but systematic racism in Peru makes many mestizos feel a rejection of Andean culture and deny the African one. On the other hand, the Japanese connection is inherited from the father and not from the mother. So from both sides, it seems like I didn't fit in. I learned that the safe place was Western culture, which promised equality, progress, and humanity after all. I was a firm believer in these principles, understanding that the only possible way to achieve balance in such a complex and diverse society as Peru's was to share the same culture. When I started my career as a young painter in the mid-90s, I recognized myself as a Western artist. I studied at the Catholic University, a very classical and methodological way to understand art. The vocation, that creative impulse, was not only a response to an individual need, it was also seen as a gift given by the creator to continue his work. And just as he had created the universe from nothing, we too had to be original and unique when filling the pristine space of a gallery. Our works had to be enduring and admirable. During my training, I never questioned why our education didn't include Andean or Amazonian art. Our past, if we had one, was Western. In the years when we finished our studies, the internal war in the country was in its final throes after almost 20 years of conflict. The atrocities committed by both sides, the armed forces against the terrorist group, and in the crossfire, the civilian Andean population were beginning to come to light, and Lima, my city, understood the fundamental role it had played, neither victim nor perpetrator, but a cowardly and silent survivor tasked with firing the bodies. Within the university, the history of art ended in the 60s. It seemed like everything that happened with new medias were a taboo, as if the school didn't want us to find out that art was changing in the other part of the world. My education, both inside and outside of school, came through catalogs, books, and magazines that arrived like genuine traveling exhibitions whenever a friend returned from a trip to the United States or Europe. Remember, it's all pre-internet era. And I started painting those images, making them real in my own way, but of course not original, was not the original one. I felt like a distorted echo, but understood as part of a common process. This exercise is part of a tradition that began with the first Andean copies of religion images. And in a way, this tradition evolves today in what is referred to as the Bamba aesthetic. Bamba projects are cheaper copies of imported branded products, but unlike the pirate or fake, it makes clear that it's not the regional one, as it highlights differences. I arrived in Spain in 2002, and I began to visit museums. Given the weak cultural infrastructure in Peru, museums had been almost non-existent during my training. It was the first time that I saw works and buildings that I only seen printed on paper. I visited both the art museums as well as the natural history, archaeology, anthropology, decorative, etc. And I had an special interest in the National Museum of Anthropology because I wanted to see the series of the miscegenation paintings commissioned by Viceroy Amat. The only cast series made in Peru, a colonial type of paintings that originated from Mexico during the 18th century in order to show and categorize the different products resulting from the mixture of the three ethnic groups that coexisted in the viceroyalties. Where the ideal mixtures that produce white people were displayed, along with the incorrect mixtures that are clearly presented as a regression. To my surprise, the series was not shown in the permanent collection. I only found one painting from a Mexican group that, isolated from its whole, was almost unrecognizable, to the point that it seemed to tell another story. The surprise continued when, after seeing the floors dedicated to each continent, I didn't find the one for Europe. So I asked for it to a guard of the museum, who was surprised by my question and told me that I had to go to other museums to find what I was looking for. That, he said, is history, and history is not here. I realized that there were two stories, and that the idea of common history existed only on the other side of the world. Neither in the Prado Museum nor in any other museum did the people and culture of the Americas appear as an integral part of Spanish history, but on the contrary, we constituted a void. We only began to exist in modern art, and especially in contemporary art, but as part of a general openness to other stories. So there I was in an uncommon place. I began to suspect the common, whatever the project, historical, economic, racial, cultural, racial miscegenation understood as a conciliatory project, and which, as joyfully as we had waved the flag of a shared culture, did not end in the common, but rather ended in the disappearance of 300 years of colonial history. This whitening project had not been completed in the American continent, but in Spain it has been successful. You could go back to being white people or Spanish people of origin, understanding that one culture was to be devoured by the other, understanding crossbreeding as a project that denies the past. So, if the museum is a place from which history is dictated, why not create a museum from which to tell another story under the same guise of institutional veracity and permanence? But from within, it can question itself, make more complex narratives, say more than stories of progress. It could move away from the idea of mestizo culture, where one divorces the other, but rather where they coexist, where they rely on each other. This new idea of mestizo is the one that José María Arguedas lived. José María Arguedas was born in Andahuaylas in 1911 in the South Andes Highlands. Arguedas departs from the idea of common race and enable us to discover a multiple-layer mestizo, a being that coexists between both sensibilities, that it is an active bridge between each culture, translating permanently in tension between the two, interlacing languages, an identity whose existence is conflictive because it belongs nowhere, but yet inhabits both. One which doesn't admit its existence without the other, one that is not a project of progress, but of life. As an anthropologist, writer, translator, and collector, he cared about tracing and recovering the idea, paradoxically both in the Andes and in Spain. He was not clothed with the ideal of purity and understood that the development of the Andean culture includes the incorporation of foreign elements in a process of reworking and resignification of these contributions, and including, of course, the museum. I've worked with the mental and physical spaces of the museum from a very early stage, moving through the concept of the fictitious contemporary art museums, using the skin of an historical museums as well, occupying real halls or converting commercial spaces into temporary museums. The most recent project in which I have used these museum codes to subvert narratives by employing their own strategies have been Pinacoteca Migrante, the Spanish pavilion at the Venice Biennale. Agustín Pérez Rubio and I conceived the Pinacoteca as a concept that migrates from Spain to the Americas as an imaginary of beauty, of what should be preserved and therefore what should also be discarded. And it is migratory also in the sense that it is ever-changing, capable of being modified and transformed, a space where other narratives can emerge. Painting, that great educator and shaper of sight, taste, and correctness, has naturalized the codes through which we value and divide reality. It has also contributed to the construction of the grand narratives that form the foundations of our nations. The Migrant Art Gallery is the result of the revisiting and searching for those stories and accounts that exist within the collection of Spanish museums, but by not being brought together, disappear, overlap, or become sugar-coated. These new paintings are presented with a surface that evokes the sketch, but also the precious detail, the unfinished, the restored, a metaphor for history as fragile, unstable, and permeable. This surface is further disrupted by text that contribute to updating the issues, reference in each of the gallery's rooms, divided like the genres of paintings, landscape, portraits, and still life. These categories reveal themselves as artificial and malleable when viewed from a critical perspective. I want to talk about one of the rooms, the Cabinet of Enlightened Racism. In Spanish, Gabinete de la Ilustración. Illustration in Spanish holds dual meaning. In one hand, a drawing, a bidimensional representation, but also to the Enlightenment as the European cultural movement that sought to illuminate the world with the light of science and legitimize its mental structure with it. and that led to the Enlightened despotism. When I received the commission to occupy the Spanish pavilion, I knew that I need help for the whole project, administrative, logical, and especially in the studio. However, curiously, for the pictorial work, only Peruvian and Latin American painters responded. It is possible to think that backwardness is a way of safeguarding Western knowledge. This vitrine, this piece is called Sometimes Heads Can Be Trophies. This vitrine displays piggy banks used by religious school in the 60s to aid marginalized communities. These head-shaped piggy banks, molded in the likeness of the same ethnic groups they were intended to help, were paraded in the hands of Spanish children. For me, they become metaphors. They became metaphors. These peoples, their bodies, their work, their knowledge, and their lands are our collective piggy bank, which we break in times of scarcity. And their development is not a systematic failure, it's the system itself. The so-called developed world requires eternally developing nations to sustain itself. The exhibition ended in the Migrant Garden. Unlike prior galleries, their architecture, artificial light, and arrangement evoking classical museums, the Migrant Garden is an open space bathed in natural light. The images in this garden do not belong to Spanish collections, nor are they located in Spanish territory, but they are part of a shared history. They arrived through the memories of migrants, putting down roots, sometimes despite the intentions of their bearers. Painting sculptures share ground with plants that, like them, arrive as stowaways or ornaments. Now branded invasive alien species, these migrant flora defy human order, exposing the limits of our control. This garden is a place to rest, to play, to sketch, to read the books that seeded this project. Knowledge here is elusive. Not everything is translated. Texts are in their original tongues, unlike the prior halls with everywhere with bilingual labels. I conceived the Migrant Garden as a space for my son, for my friends, to be together. It became a site of unplanned rituals, impromptu concerts, a crossroads we hadn't foreseen. It all was very pretty, but how to speak of sustainability and earth care while exhibiting in Venice, in a place as Venice? How to celebrate art in the middle of a war? Is it consistent to speak from these spaces? Should we participate in this kind of encounters where our participation is understood or could be understood as a whitewashing of the West or as an artist selling out to the system? It is a form of consensual cultural extractivism. In our world system, there is no first world without the third. And I'm not just talking about geographical areas, but also social and economical divisions. To demand artistic purity ignores the symbolic power of occupying these spaces like this one, for example. But demanding purity is also a way of silencing, because it requires a fixed place of enunciation that for many no longer exists. As I said previously, in the cast paintings, they also illustrate those non-ideal mixtures, the ones that should be avoided. To identify as mestizos here in the metropolis and in the periphery, it is a way of stepping away from the ideal. It is a way of asserting ourselves as non-pure, as alternative products that do not submit to their erasure. We remain those cholos, mulatos, zambos, those I don't understand you, or those salta para atrás, jump back. I'm not a Quechua speaker, but I know that in Quechua, there are two different types of we. One that includes the listener and one does not. The colonial task requires create or maybe borrow words that exist in other society to name and recognize ourselves again. Thank you.
Is it already my turn?
I guess so.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yes, I think so. I think that maybe Robert Jan is just, because there is some problems with the connection. So please, Christian,
No problem.
now it's your turn.
I'm just grateful. Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you very much.
sorry, I had a technical glitch.
Yeah.
Totally made by myself. Sorry. Thank you, Sandra, for this enlightening contribution. This webinar is about extractivism, but you talked about the invasiveness. You talked about gardens. I saw these children with the heads in their hands. It's an invasiveness in the upbringing, of course, and it's about, well, you showed the Museum of Ethnology in Madrid, and it says "Know thyself" on the facade.
Yeah.
And I would like to bring that in connection with what Christian told about consciousness and identity. What eventually is identity? What is knowing yourself? I'd like to go immediately over to Christian and his response. And in the meantime, I would like to invite all the participants to be really participants by writing your comment or your question in the chat box. But over to you, Christian. And again, thank you very much, Sandra.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Paula and Sandra. Very, very interesting presentations. You will remember that I started my input with a reference to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book on the decolonization of mind, decolonizing the mind. I think that you both really pointed out very clearly how art, culture, science, and popular media have been working for hundreds of years on the colonization of the mind, colonization of the minds, we should say, both on the side of the colonizer and of the side of the colonized. I think that's really interesting to have the opportunity to listen to your two presentations right after each other, because I think you speak from two quite different points of view, two quite different sorts of experiences. So you both speak about stereotypes, you both speak about racist imaginaries, the production of a racist and colonial imaginary through colonial practices in the media, in the arts, in science, anthropology, and so on and so on. And you also, you have a lot of, you share many, I would say, you share many points of observation, examination, critique, and refusal. But at the same time, it was really fascinating to see how Paula, as I understood it, works through the colonial archive from more or less the perspective of the descendants of the colonizers. Whereas Sandra also, I mean, the very first sentence, one of the very first sentences that you said was you speaking about yourself as becoming an artist, saying, I considered myself as a Western artist. And I think that's fascinating. And of course, it's problematic. And you worked through your own, you developed your own means, extremely interesting means and methods to work yourself through the artistic colonization of your mind, your spirit, your whatever, your imagination as an artist. So when you develop this method of copying, for instance, this kind of a pirate culture as an artist, kind of parasite. I mean, you use what you get, and you at the same time you reduce it in size. You reduce its power. You reduce its over yourself. So you can handle it. You can learn. As I would say, you can learn from it. You can take from it. You can benefit. But you also kind of put it in its place, and it gives you the opportunity to develop your own aesthetics, your own. I hesitate, but it has something to do using your own words as a kind of mestizo aesthetics also. And this is really interesting to see in comparison to Paula's methods of how to intervene. Paula, what you said about the archival material is not only to be researched, but it calls for an intervention. Now, this is methodologically, I think this is maybe the core of your approach. And you both somehow take or you make use of the colonial imaginary, the colonial images, and how they exercise their power on the minds and the consciousness and the feelings and even the bodies, I would say, of people. And you ask yourself of how to find means to intervene and to liberate. So I mean, coming back to the question of the liberation or the decolonization of identities, I think it's very interesting to have these two different entry points into material that is not the same, of course, but shares colonial histories of oppression, but also histories of resistance and refusal. So this is to put these two presentations. This is how they arrived at my mind. And of course, I would be happy to ask questions. My own interest is in particular in questions of method. How do you actually do what you want to do? We all are, I mean, more or less, we are aware of the problematic history of image making we all have a certain knowledge of the kind of, very problematic material that we find in all these archives. But we do not necessarily agree on our concepts of how we do make use of them, how we work with these images, how we maybe also transform them into something that opens a space for a different politics, different agency. Paula, you mentioned the why it's necessary to intervene is also to discover the hidden agency of the colonized. I think that's very important. That we just do not use the material, do not reproduce the material, but to find hidden stories and different agencies. Yeah, that's something that I that came to my mind when listening to your both fascinating presentation. Maybe we can speak about some of these questions of yeah, how you are challenged by the material, how you use it, and I mean, it's really different what you do. Towards the end of your presentation, Sandra, you show us images of that is not just not restricted or limited to the image itself, but it opens a space for encounter, space for discussion, space for negotiation, or maybe also processes of healing, or also. So there's lots of different ways and methods that you apply to deal with questions that are that overlap, but are quite, at the other hand, again, quite different, I would say.
Can I ask a question, please? This is Robert again. Christian?
Yeah, sure.
I was thinking with the presentation of Sandra, I saw the work which was a combination of a work by Joseph Albers, and they were, I don't know, paintings after press photos, I think, and they were combined. And I was thinking, because it has to do with, well, to say the function of art, to make aware of something. But you use art, you use modernism, and I had to look at the exhibition that Christian made, which is, let me see, contemporary art and decolonial modernism. What can you say about what art can, let's say, do in the sense of making aware, or purification, maybe, of history? What can you say something about that painting in particular, with the Joseph Albers background?
Oh, this painting was part of an exhibition that was named Lo que nos hizo modernos, what made us moderns. There's a sociologist that is Mirko Lauer, that he said that what really make modern Peruvians was not the technology or the science. That really made us modern was the violence. So I mix these views of modernity, these views of because when all the other countries in Latin America start to use abstraction or geometric abstraction as a way to be modern. It was aligned with their technical development. But in Peru, we were in completely economic crash, and we looked to the Andes. So our modernity was a kind of indigenous view, not a completely realist and an abstraction. So our modernity arrived later, maybe 30 years later, and it was produced because the terrorist violence wake up from this colonial system that was going on through all the time, through all our republic. So in a way, when this is another situation that it overlapped these paintings, the Incas designs that was and pre-Columbian designs was mostly geometrical, and they have or they gain a kind of prestige and value after Europeans artists like Albert, for example, discover this kind of designs. So for me, these paintings, that there is a lot of them. I try to paint all these square homage that are based on Mexican architecture. I put in the center of this square, of this homage, all those people that were outside of this modernity that was pretended to be.
Thank you. And Paula, can I ask you? By the way, please ask your questions. There's very little comments and questions in the march. So please add your thoughts, even if you have some. And Paula, your strategy is not as a contrast with Sandra's work, but maybe even as an addition. You don't use artworks. You use very straightforward films, documentary films. Is that for you off the plate, working and reflecting on art? Is that?
Well, I do see cinema as art, but I understand the comment, obviously, because these are documentary and pre-documentary films, right? However, I do work with them as an artist. And mainly the reason why I've chosen these films is really because when we're looking at the visual culture that we're living in nowadays, a lot of these particular stereotypes are coming from films like this that were not directly considered scientific films, but that use this para-ethnographic visual language. And relating now to some of the comments that Christian made. First of all, Sandra, I would like to congratulate you on your presentation. I loved it, and I already knew your work, but I'm so happy to hear how you actually talk about it. And so thank you so much for that. Very inspiring. And Christian, yes, we do look at the production of racial imaginaries and especially the imperial imaginary, the colonial imaginary, In my case, when looking at the Dutch colonial collection, it is probably true that I am mostly coming at it from a more, European perspective. However, when looking at the Portuguese archive, I do have partial Indian ancestry. So when looking at the Portuguese colonial archive, I am going at it from definitely a different type of involvement. And here is where this search for agency may also really shift. I mean, not the search itself, but the way that I work with the materials. Because when engaging with people who are being portrayed, that I do not have direct relations to, I do feel a lot more careful and making sure that these people are really treated with the utmost respect, and that these films allow for a temporal compression in which their presence, even if we don't see them, becomes all the more like a specter, like we allow the specter to haunt us by acknowledging its presence. And so when I look at the materials from India that were filmed by the Portuguese settlers, there I see a lot of people that actually look like my family. And I believe that then my approach will be very different as well. And when we're discussing methods, I showed you different things, right? I showed you the film about Indonesia that works only with domestic films from Indonesia. Then I showed the film that was made in Suriname with the Indian people. And the last thing I showed is actually not a work yet. It's not supposed to be public, but okay, here we are. That is going to be part of this installation at AICA Museum in February. And there I am looking at different materials. And some of them do show the people, because I feel like there is this dimension of agency and these untold stories that come to the fore just by editing the materials in a particular way. Or drawing attention to certain moments in the frame. But others, again, I use the glitch because you do see what Paul Julien is doing. And if you see the bodies, then it becomes just another para-ethnographic film. But if you don't see, then you really pay attention to all the gestures and the way that he's actually handling these people as if they would be completely interchangeable, intermutable. And there is a moment, and I showed you just a teeny tiny clip at the end, in which there is a masked character from Sierra Leone who is doing a dance. And in that moment, I really believe that we are dealing with an agency that the camera cannot control anymore. So the colonizing camera cannot control a character that is seeing the camera without allowing itself to be seen. So I think I will round it off.
Thank you. Thank you. There is a question or there is a remark from Mr. Ulf Edman Ziegler. Camille, can you unmute Mr. Ziegler?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Well, I follow the themes of post-colonialism and such because I do wonder what does make the subject so important exactly in our times, and if there is any progress. And I've been here from the very beginning of this session, and I must say, now almost 2 hours, I really wonder to whom, to what kind of audience this is addressed. I mean, I do see some of the participants in images, and they're smiling and they're nodding and finding everything great. But well, if this kind of study or working in art as a study on colonialism is meant to be for those who are on a good side, and everybody who lived at that time and wasn't sheer a victim was simply bad, then we are in the dichotomy of good and bad. We are very close to religion, to Christian religion. So on the one side are we are the born agains, and on the other side are those who got to go to hell. Now, okay, that's 100 years ago and they're all dead, but still they got to go to hell. So this is a divide I watch with, I'm alarmed, I must say. And as to the presentations, of course, they were helpful, but they were all done by those who make the work. I mean, Mr. Cravagna as an exhibition maker, and Ms. Albuquerque as somebody working on film, and from Saga, I saw your name in your picture, written like this, on your own artwork. Well, this is of course not very close to art criticism, because art criticism is always on something you did not do yourself. So it's quite far away from our profession. Anyway, I must address Mrs. Albuquerque's way of treating films, the originals, and changing them. I mean, you say, Mrs. Albuquerque, that you watch these films, you understand what's being done, and you do tell us what's being done, and you also put it in a certain category, and you have your judgment on it. So your comment is in a way complete and cannot be much doubted. What you do, though, I mean, I'm referring to I think it was I'm referring to the part of the film you showed with bodies of whom you later said that you had turned them sort of into plants. Well, okay, if this is a bit short, but roughly. Well, I don't think that you can do that. I think that you are putting yourself at the forefront of somebody who understands evil things, then covers them up because the others may not see it, and then you develop a digital structure so that we are sort of, it's proven that we can't see it. We actually cannot. So we cannot make up our own minds. We are obviously not fit to be victims of what you call, I think, something like colonial pornography or so. So we must be, you know, and I really do not understand where this is going, and I have a very bad feeling about it.
Yeah. So the question, Paula, did you get the question of Mr. Ziegler?
No, there was not really a question. There was a comment, and I'll accept it that is how it can be experienced.
Maybe can I respond to this question or this comment?
Yes, please, Christian.
Maybe, I mean, that would be many things to be said in response. But I think one of the main questions is about the presupposed opposition of the good and the bad, of the past and the present. I don't believe that we can see it in this way. It's not just because we have been born much later that we are on the good side, and it's not that other people have been working much earlier, doing things in different way, automatically have been on the bad side or whatever. I don't believe in this good and bad, but I believe in historic consciousness and in historic examination and research and historic differentiation. And this is what both the two artists who presented and we as curators and historians and art historians most often do, that we also have a very close look into the past with regards to the question, okay, what was actually the scope of the possibility of actions and agencies in a certain moment of time? Of course, in 1900, people, let's say Europeans, who were supposedly naturally on the side of the colonizers, had different options, maybe fewer options than we have now when it comes to questions of opposing or criticizing colonial practices. But there have always been people, parties, political parties, movements, artists who were very much engaged in, for instance, anti-racist and anti-colonial work. So I don't think that it's about the past and the present as the good and the bad, but it's rather about a close and critical look at what people in a certain period of time at a certain place in the world could do differently than, for instance, the majority that supported the colonial violence and racism. I think this is something, I mean, the overall question to whom this webinar is addressed, I cannot really answer because it wasn't my was not my idea. And I have been working as an art critic for decades, so I know what art critics do. Sometimes they become curators and they make different use of their knowledge, of their experience of what artists do. Still, art criticism, I think, is still active, and artists are also very important art critics when it comes to the critique of art historians and curators.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, well, who it is addressed to, I think here that most of us are a group of intermediaries, if you're not an artist, maybe. And so it's a broad range of people. But there is a remark, which is a question to Paula from Antonis Danos. Maybe you can elaborate on that question, which is, don't you, Paula, with the glitzing these colonized subjects, won't you be erasing them or otherwise conflating them with nature, since you glitch them by integrating them with images from nature? So don't you emphasize maybe a preconceived idea about these people? Can you say something about it? Can Paula?
Sure.
Yeah, you're unmuted.
No, that's a very clear question. Well, what I am doing is I'm actually bringing the imagery of these people's bodies together with surveillance imagery. And the surveillance imagery of that area happens to be from nature and from these animals. What I was really interested in doing is not making them fall into the background of nature, obviously subhuman, because, well, obviously that was one of the problems in working with this imagery, but actually to allow them to get a particular third dimensionality that is together with the, let's say, the presence of Suriname exactly in the same area right now. And that doesn't erase them, because erasing them would be really to take them out and allow the image to become completely flat. The film is not doing that. What the film is doing is provoking debate. So what happens when you intervene in a film directly like this? The film still exists, the film is there, but how do we look at these archives? You know, if we don't, and maybe in this case, the public would definitely be the archivists themselves and who is working with these archives. How do you provoke this dialogue without time and again showing a film that has been made with a very particular purpose? And you know, it's not just the framing, but also the actual emulsion. So analog film, as probably everybody here knows, the emulsion was developed to properly expose the white skin, and any other skin becomes muddled. Facial features are not anymore distinguishable between individuals. So what I'm doing by somehow homogenizing the bodies is drawing attention to the fact that this particular camera, this particular emulsion was already doing this. And I will just add one more thing. The fact that I'm conflating it with surveillance imagery is to also draw attention to the fact that we can say, okay, back then, you know, it's the technology they had and it didn't expose properly, but we're now discussing digital means in surveillance data sets that are supposedly or enabling you to properly identify people. Still, the filters are exactly the same. And you keep on misidentifying people based on skin color. So that's why.
Thank you. Thank you. So sorry, I have to cut you off there. We have 3 minutes left. There is only one question, which is very maybe for Christian, and that is from Helen Aydogan. Is Harlem Renaissance a reaction to colonization? And thank you for the experience. Could you say something in very few words about that?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for the question. Harlem Renaissance, actually, at the the term Harlem Renaissance is a kind of retro factual description of what happened in the from the First World War to the 1930s in Black culture and the arts in the United States. It was called the New Negro Movement at the time. And I think if you have the historic term in mind, it becomes quite clear what it was about. It was about the decolonization of identities. It was about creating a new image, a new self-understanding of the Black people in the United States in particular, but it was not just United States. This is something that we often think, Harlem, New York, US. Harlem at that time, all the activists, artists and writers many of them came from the Caribbean. Many came even from African countries. So it's part of a colonial diaspora at the time. And it is very closely related to the Negritude movement, which was the kind of French discursive space counterpart to the Harlem Renaissance. So there is a definite reaction to the colonial racist, not just imaginary but violent treatment of people of African descent, in particular during slavery and colonial times. Yes, I would say it is a reaction to colonialism at large.
That's very interesting, creating a new identity. Yes, yeah. Well, thank you very much. Time is up. And I'd like to thank you all for first for Christian, Sandra, and Paula for contributing with their wonderful presentations. And thank you all for your questions and remarks, for being there. And we will have a written report of this webinar, which will be published well, within weeks, which will be published on the AICA International website and maybe also on the national websites of AICA. And of course, the recording you can find on YouTube, I think within some weeks. And you can find the link, of course, on the AICA International website. Thank you so much, Camille, for supporting this webinar. And I especially wanted to thank Karen von Vee, who in Johannesburg, together with organizing the international what is
Congress,
it?
the Congress.
The International Congress.
The AICA Congress.
Was very, very supportive for organizing this webinar. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next time on one of the webinars of the AICA Forum Committee webinars.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
everybody.